Right, hello and welcome to another Dauntless Development tutorial video. So this is another C# beginner tutorial, and today we're going to be looking at namespaces, and we're going to be seeing how we compare them together with static classes and static functions in order to recreate something a bit similar to what you see here with this console.read key and other things that we tend to use when we're using C#. Now, to start off, we need to create a new class, and we've done this before, but in case you don't know, you go over to the Solution Explorer, you can right click, add new item, or you can add class specifically, and then just say here. So what we're going to do, we're going to use this namespace to make a maths class. So it's going to just do some mathematic functions, like addition and multiplication, obviously stuff that you can do already, but this is just for an example. So we have this maths class here. Now, what we can do, as you see, it's got this namespace tutorials, which is the same as this. Now, previously, what I've said is you should have everything under the same namespace. Now, that does work, but if you want to separate code out, and you want to make it kind of reusable elsewhere, you can make a namespace for a section of code, which you could then reuse somewhere else. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to change this namespace to maths. And now this namespace here, you can no longer, so previously we would have been able to create a class here called maths, but we can't. Now you see there is a math one, that's why it's not the only reason I'm using S. I am English, so we put an S on the end. So you know what, I'm going to call the namespace DD maths. So there we go. So we have this namespace called DD maths, and now we can't access it from inside here. Now, if you want to access it, what we can do is right at the top here, you can see this using system.text and using system and stuff like that. These are all namespaces. So when you want to use a namespace, you say using, and then I can say DD maths, and there we go. Now, when we go into here, we should be able to see, put it inside the function for now, maths, and there we go. That's the class that we have. So we can create a version of that. So we can access it like that. Now what we're going to do is we're going to make this a static class. Now the reason we're going to do this is, as we've discussed previously with static classes, is static means that there's only going to be one. So that means that when we are including this DD maths, we can then use maths directly anywhere else. Now, that might sound a bit confusing, so what I'll do is, just to make things clear, I'll add a function. So I'm just going to make an addition function. So I'm going to make a function called static, because every function and every variable inside a static class must be static. So I'm going to make a static, and let's return an int, because we'll just do whole numbers for now. And I'm going to call this addition. And I'm going to just have an int a and an int b. So these are the input variables to the function. And it's going to return a plus b. Oops. So now what we can do, just to kind of explain the point. So we're using this DD maths namespace, and now what we can do is we can say maths dot, hang on a second, here we go, goodness me. There we go, that's why. So one other thing that is important is you need to mark it as public, which I didn't do. If you don't mark it as public, it's by default private. So it's a static public function and a static public class. So now I can say maths dot addition, and then we could say 1, 2, and it would add them together. So you can see that this has a very similar format to how this console.read key and how we've used console.writeline and stuff like that. So that's kind of how all, like behind the scenes, all that's set up. Now, right here, we can only add integers together. Now, what if you wanted to add floating point numbers or doubles or unsigned ints or other forms of numbers. But you don't want to have a function called addition float, addition whatever. Well, you can use the same name again, and this is called function overloading. Now, it's not function overriding, because that is used in inheritance. It's function overloading. So static. So I'm going to make a new one. I'm going to call it static. And if I can hit the right key, that would be nice. Static public int addition. And here we're going to say int. Sorry, not int. We're not going to say int. In fact, we're not going to have. We're going to have a float here. And we're going to say float a float. Oops. B. And then we're going to say return a plus b. Oops. And now you see, if we use a float here, so we now have a version of this function with the exact same name, where it returns a float and passes out, and you pass in floats to begin with. So now if we said maths addition, and you open the brackets, you'll see here that there is a 1 out of 2 here. So if you press down on your keyboard, so on your little directional keys, you can see that it switches between them. So we've got float and we've got an int version. So if we put floats in here, so if I said 1.0 f and 2.0 f, you can see that this one, when we mouse over, says it's returning a float and it's taking 2 floats. And this one says it's returning an int and it's taking 2 ints. So it automatically detects, depending on what inputs you provide it, what kind of function it needs to be. Now, obviously, this is limited by how many options you give it. If you gave it a mixed between an int and a float, it might get upset, although I'm relatively certain it will allow you, it'll just choose the float option. I'll double check that now. But generally, things are intelligent enough to notice. But I'll try that and get an answer. Yeah, so it's using the float option. So it will, you don't need to create a specific case for a float and an int, or an int and a float different ways. It'll choose basically the best option, but you can essentially create another version of this addition function or whatever function again and again and again until you have every possible type of input. This is obviously very useful because instead of having, you can have lots of functions under the same name, which means that you don't have very long function names. You can just have addition, which is all the description you need to provide. Now, as you see, with this being a static class, we can just access that directly. Now, if we weren't using a static class, so you can make a new, one thing that is worth noting is you don't need to create a new class in a different file every time. It's generally the best thing to do. But sometimes if you're working in a namespace, and maybe you've got lots of static classes, it can make a lot of sense to keep it all under one file, but it really doesn't matter as long as they're in the same namespace. But just for simplicity's sake, I'll just make a new class here. So I'm just going to make a public class, and I'll just call this class A, just because it's not going to do much. And then I'll just have a function, so public void. In fact, public. No. I'll just leave public void. Public void, and I'll call it print message. This is very similar to what we've done previously. If you've seen the previous videos, print message, and this is just going to be console dot write line, and I'm just going to say this is a non-static class. Oops, there we go. So now what we can do is we can say, so when we are inside the program here, inside this main static class, if we declare a variable outside of this function, it must be marked as static. Everything inside a static class must be static, as I've said before. So we're going to declare a static class A, and we'll just call it CA. In fact, we'll just take that name there that it suggests. And then what we can do is we can say inside this function, class A dot print message. So you can see the difference between using a static class and a normal class is, with a normal class, you've got to declare it. You've got to declare that it is a type, that you're declaring an instance of the class. So you're saying, I am making a version of class A, and then you're calling that specific version to print message. And then you could do the same thing again, class A, and this time I'm just going to say class A, B, just because it's called class A. And then you could say class A, B, dot print message, and that would call this function in this specific version of that class. Whereas what we're doing here is we're saying with the static class here, there is only one version, there is only ever one copy, so it's kind of globally accessible. So whenever you do anything, you're accessing this specifically. Now, a lot of the time with these kind of classes, you won't be storing any variables. Now, the reason for that is because obviously if you want to change variables, you generally don't want them to be changed. You don't want to be able to change them from lots of different places, just in case it messes things up. So these tend to be classes which are full of lots of useful functions, but not necessarily variables. So yeah, that's kind of a little bit of, so that's function overloading, a bit more on static classes and namespaces. Now, as I said, you can say this using namespace, using DD maths. Anything that shares the same namespace, you don't need to say that you're using the namespace. So as you can see here, even though I don't say I'm using namespace tutorials, because it is actually within this namespace, I can use anything inside it. So if I made another class here, so I said static. In fact, I don't even think I need to make it static, so I can just say public class, and then I'll just call it class B. And then in here, I can make a static class B, and I'll just call it class B. Although I don't want a capital because that's not a really good naming convention. But you can see that even though right here we don't say using namespace tutorials, because it is inside this namespace and they share the same namespace, then you don't need to declare that you are using the same namespace. But yeah, I mean, namespaces are relatively simple. It's just a good way of organizing code so that you can make sure that you're only accessing as much code as what you need to, so that you can have functions, say, named very similar, or you can have functions that are named the exact same thing, but in different namespaces. And then you can only say that you're using the namespace that you want to use, which avoids any conflicts. But as I said, it's a way of recycling code as well. So although in here we only have two versions of an addition function, which the function is pretty useless, you could have all sorts of different things, like you could have trigonometry, you could have quadratics and stuff like that. You could have loads of different maths functionality inside a big static class, and then you could make that big static class once inside a namespace, for example, and then you never need to make it again. You never need to write that code again, because you can just take that file, which has all your maths functionality. Maybe you've got vector maths and stuff like that, matrices, and all that complicated stuff that requires a lot of code. You can just make it into a namespace and you could bring it over to anything else. Now, the benefit of this is I've used this myself in games in which I've made a pathfinding namespace. and that works with any C# program. Now I'm using it in Unity, and I do almost all my work within Unity. But for example, if I wanted to write it in SFML, I wanted to use some pathfinding in SFML, I can use that same code which I've written for Unity in, oops, sorry, hit the microphone. I can use that exact same code in a totally different engine, in a totally different project, because by just including this namespace, which is why it's very useful. But yeah, that's all for today. So thank you for watching. If you've got any questions, leave them in the comments, and I'll see you next time.